Coming up this time, when Brian met Greavesy.
It was just wonderful to listen to two old friends chewing over past times and both being very honest and frank with each other. It was almost a competition between the two of them who could get the first word in.
Yes.
And Cloughie, of course, won that.
And not forgetting when Frank Sinatra met Cloughie.
When Cloughie and I used to talk, we used to spend most of the time talking about Sinatra songs and Muhammad Ali, who was another one he idolised. He said he was surrounded by bodyguards, but Frank had been told what I'd done in football, and he was very keen on sport. And he said the conversation switched from Frank singing to boxing.
There's a musical tribute for Cloughie's favourite commentator.
And Brian comes in carrying the presentation thing, and he's singing the Frank Sinatra song, You're the Top. It made great television. We got 2 minutes of Brian Clough serenading Brian Moore.
And how a star signing was told to get the kettle on.
He said, "Here, come and meet the world's greatest goalkeeper." And then he shouted through the door, once we're all in position, "Children, tea for 5. He'd reduced the world's greatest goalkeeper to a tea boy.
All that and a whole collection of other Cloughie stories over the next 30 minutes.
All the lads I worked with are still my friends. And I never picked up a paper and read where Cloughie was this and Cloughie was that. Nobody ever gives me any stick. They couldn't, because I was their best friend as well.
You're listening to the Green Jumper podcast with myself, Marcus Alton, the editor of brianclough.com. And my guest today is a former Fleet Street journalist who's worked with many of the big names in sport, including Brian Clough. He's played a key role behind the scenes in countless TV programmes over the years, and is now a successful author of more than 100 books, the latest being the official biography of a footballing legend who Cloughie described as a genius, and that was Jimmy Greaves. I'm delighted to say hello to Norman Giller.
Hello there, Marcus, and can I first of all say that it's a pleasure to be speaking to you and your Green Jumper followers, and I'm particularly pleased to be brought to you by remembering two of my favourite people, Cloughie and Greavesy. They were the Saint Greavesy before Saint Greavesy, if you can follow me.
Yes, of course, yeah. And I know Greavesy and Cloughie were rivals, I think, as players, but they always had great respect for each other, didn't they?
Not only great respect, great friendship. I mean, they played together twice for England back in 1959, which is when I first met them. This was, when I first went to Cloughie, this was at the Roehampton training ground that the England team used under the then manager Walter Winterbottom.
Yes.
And the Brian Clough I met back then was nothing like the Brian who later became a legend in his own lifetime. He was a quiet guy, wanted to take a back seat because he felt overawed being with the likes of Bobby Charlton and Jimmy Greaves, two players who he idolised.
Wow, you can't imagine Brian Clough being shy and retiring, can you?
He was. He had a teammate, they were both from Middlesbrough, called Edwin Holliday, who was a winger, and they were both making their debut for England against Wales. And Edwin was the character of the two of them. He was the one you thought, he'd make a good television personality. But it was Cloughie who came through, of course, as one of the forces of nature. He became as big as legend as Robin Hood in Nottingham, where you are now.
That's right. And I know they shared lots of laughs in later years when Jimmy was winning a whole new generation of fans, really, as part of the Saint and Greavesy TV partnership. And Brian was often interviewed as part of that, wasn't he?
Well, when Jimmy first went into broadcasting, he'd recently conquered his drinking problem, which is a miracle in itself, because he had been lost to the bottle for 5 years. But he made it known that he was becoming a columnist with The Sun. And the very first call he got at home was from Cloughie, who insisted that Jimmy get on the next train up to Nottingham, and he would give him, for nowt, as Cloughie would say, an interview, which was a big thing then because Cloughie was so in demand. And so Jimmy and I, me armed with a tape recorder, we went up to Nottingham and sat down in Brian's office while Jimmy and Cloughie reminisced. And I would have paid to be to be the man taping it. I was a very lucky boy.
That must have been really special to be between those two legends of the game as they talked things over. Were you nervous?
No, I wasn't at all nervous. I was very, very much the third man in the interview, keeping in the background, and it was just wonderful to listen to two old friends chewing over past times and both being very honest and frank with each other. I mean, when it came to transposing the tape, I had to cut out quite a few of the more colourful words.
I bet you did.
They didn't mess about. They both dropped the F-bomb very often.
Yes. I bet you couldn't shut them up, could you? I bet they could have talked all day.
Well, it was almost a competition between the two of them who could get the first word in.
Yes.
And Cloughie, of course, won that. But the point I want to underline is that there was Brian, who just won 2 European back-to-back European Championship, and he was giving Jimmy this interview purely to help him up, give him a leg up into his new career as a broadcaster, and it just showed the generosity of spirit of Cloughie.
Certainly did, didn't it? And I know he always sort of had a friendly dig with Jimmy Greaves on the fact that he scored the fastest 250 Football League goals. He used to like to boast, and I think Jimmy would always say, "Oh, not that chestnut again."
No, Jimmy would bow the knee to Cloughie as a goal scorer,
yes.
But he would also quietly point out that most of his were in the second division, where every one of Jimmy's 357 goals were in the first division.
Yes.
Which is a record that will never be beaten because that division's gone now.
And that, as you said, they played together for England, but Clough certainly said that Sir Walter Winterbottom couldn't get the best out of them all together because they played...
No, it didn't work because they were both instinctive players and instinctively went into the same position for crosses, and they were continually getting in each other's way. Cloughie told a funny story about the match against Sweden. The first match was drawn 1-1 against Wales, and 11 days later, Walter Winterbottom decided to have one more go, and they played against Sweden at Wembley, and they lost that match 3-2. And at one stage in the game, the ball hit the underside of the bar and came down onto the goal line, and Cloughie, trying to reach the ball, fell over and found himself sitting on the ball. And he said, "I was on the bloody ball so long, it was a wonder I didn't hatch the bloody thing." And he couldn't get the ball into the net. He just sat in it.
Yes. He didn't have a great deal of luck, which you do need as an England player. But I think from a personal point of view, Cloughie wrote in his autobiography how he admired Jimmy for the way he'd overcome his drink problem, which really was a turning point, wasn't it?
Well, I was lucky to be very, very close to Jimmy right from when we were both 17 years old. And so I saw him go into that slow descent into alcoholism. And like most people who were close to him, we thought there's no way was he going to beat it. But he had the character to overcome it. And many years later, he was able to help Brian overcome a similar problem. And it showed the rapport between the two men that Brian respected Jimmy enough to follow his advice. And he also overcame a drink problem, as we all know.
I know when I was campaigning to get Cloughie a knighthood, Greavesy dedicated one of his newspaper columns to supporting the idea. And when you consider that the likes of Sir Alex Ferguson wouldn't support it, it really was a significant boost to get that backing. Greavesy still thought a lot of his old friend, didn't he?
Jimmy would have put Cloughie in the House of Lords. He thought he should have been running English football.
Yeah.
But the FA were frightened of Brian, quite rightly, because they thought, well, if we appoint Brian Clough, he's going to try to run the FA. And too right he would have done. And he would have sorted the FA out. And but Brian had this great idea of tackling football from the grassroots, which is what they're talking about now with the Lionesses, to get to the kids. And this was going to be Cloughie's idea. But of course, the FA were too frightened of him, so he was going to change the FA from top to bottom. And his main idea was to bring through the youth of the country. But sadly, he was never ever given the opportunity.
No, that's right. The best manager England never had.
Marcus, Brian was his own worst enemy because he was so outspoken. He needed to have had some sort of interior mechanism that could have stopped him talking. Because if he could have held back some of his opinions, yes, he wouldn't have frightened the top brass. But Brian, loved to make people know exactly what he felt. And sometimes it hurt people's feelings.
Well, you interviewed Brian, I think, when he became Derby manager back in the late 60s. What was that like?
I was privileged to be the first one to interview him, and it was a pure accident because there was a legend of a football reporter called Alan Williams, was the Daily Express king of the Midlands, but he just happened to be on holiday the week that Cloughie arrived from Hartlepool to take over at Derby. And so I was sent up from London to interview him. And when I arrived at the baseball ground, Brian was just leading all the players onto a coach, and they were going off on a pre-season tour. And so my first interview with Brian, he said, "Here, get on the court, lad. Come on, I'll let you talk. Come on, I wouldn't let you come all the way from London and not get something."
Brilliant.
And so there I was in the standing on the coach, talking to Cloughie on the way to the airport. And that was the first interview he ever gave. And I remember a wonderful phrase of his was, "I'm going to give Derby," he said, a little bit of amnesia and a lot of ambition. He said, "Amnesia, because I don't want anybody talking about their bloody past. I've had enough. I don't care about what Jackie Stamps did. I want to know what my team going to do next week, not Jackie Stamps bloody 30 years ago."
Yes.
He said, and so that's the amnesia. He said, but we're also going to be a club with lots of ambition. And I thought, what a line, mixing up the amnesia and ambition. And that was my very first interview with him. Brian Clough is going to get rid of your memories of the good days, and he's going to bring golden days to the baseball ground, and he certainly did that.
You've described Cloughie as God's gift to journalists, and that turn of phrase you've just mentioned there, amnesia and ambition, it really did help give journalists the lines that they wanted, didn't it?
Oh dear. If you went to Cloughie with an empty notebook, by the time you'd finished listening to him, not talking to him, listening to him, you had a full notebook, and he never ever left you without a line. And he had this instinctive way, almost like he was as a player. He knew exactly when to strike, and he would give you the line that he knew would make the headlines the next day. He was a master at it.
Obviously, his man management was outstanding as well, wasn't it?
Well, I remember when he signed Peter Shilton, and he called it wasn't just me, about 5 pressmen into the office. He said, "Hey, come and meet the world's greatest goalkeeper." And then he shouted through the door, and once we're all in position, ready to take notes, shout through the door, "Children, tea for 5. Do you have sugar, lad? Right, sugar, milk, sugar. 4 with sugar, 2 without." And Schultz comes in carrying cups of tea. He'd reduced the world's greatest goalkeeper to a tea boy.
Yes, it was that knack of keeping certain players' feet firmly on the ground, wasn't it, really? And I think he did that with Trevor Francis as well when he signed, what was billed as the first £1 million player. And
I mean, that if it doesn't stand close examination, because it was only after they added that. Even so, he could definitely claim to be the first £1 million footballer, but he was always in awe of Cloughie, and Cloughie made sure that he kept his feet to the ground. Trevor was a Jimmy Greaves of his time, at his peak.
Another key signing, of course, and this goes back to the Derby days, was Dave Mackay, who he got from Spurs, and it was Spurs manager Bill Nicholson at the time, I think. But he pulled off a masterstroke there.
Dave was all set to return to Hearts as player manager.
Mm.
That's how he's going to wind down his career. And Cloughie's arrived, been given permission to talk to Dave. He's taken over Bill Nicholson's office. And as Dave's come in, he stood up, gone and locked the door. He said, "You're not going to leave here until you sign a piece of paper that says you're my player. You're going to play for Derby County." And sure enough, after an hour, very clever negotiating, because Dave Mackay was very shrewd, of course, and he squeezed every penny he could out of it. And he finished up. He gave him a column in the programme for which he was paying more money than he was paying any other first-team player. That was before his wages.
Yes.
So Cloughie was very clever the way he signed Dave. But where Dave was, he couldn't believe it. He was being told that you're not going to play your buccaneering role that you've done for 10 great years at Spurs. You're going to play in defence. And I've got a young lad coming along called Roy McFarland. You're going to teach him how to play the game. And he played Dave alongside him, saving his legs, which were really wonky at the time. And Dave spent a season and a half showing Roy, the art of positional play. And Roy became one of Europe's great centre halves. And Dave saw out his career by winning the promotion to First Division.
Yes, yeah.
But it was Cloughie who was the mastermind, because he saw in Dave, he knew that his legs had gone, but he knew that his brain was intact. And he used that brain power to get Derby back into the First Division.
Yeah, it was absolutely inspired, really. Now, you also worked on a tribute to Cloughie's favourite commentator, Brian Moore. And I think that TV programme actually took you to Cloughie's house for some filming.
Brian was coming up to his retirement from ITV, and this was going to be his swan song. And we went into Brian's house, and this is Cloughie's house, along with his lovely wife, who sat there politely giving us tea. This is just in their lounge. There was Brian Clough, Brian Moore, and our producer-director, also Top Gear director, Brian Klein. So in the space of about 10 square yards, I've got 3 Brians that I'm trying to interview. And it was hilarious. The number of times you got Brian wrong. And in the middle of it all, Brian puts on a Sinatra record, and he sings along with Sinatra and telling us all about his experiences of having met the great man. And later that day, we were sitting in Brian's garden, without Brian Moore knowing. I'd organised for a presentation by Cloughie to Brian Moore to mark his 30 years at the microphone with ITV. And Brian's disappeared behind a hedge, and there's Brian Moore sitting, bringing Brian Clough in for final word on my ITV career. Here's my great friend Brian Clough, and Brian comes in carrying the presentation thing. It was an autographed cartoon of Brian Moore. So he's come in and he's singing from the night before the Frank Sinatra song, "You're the Top." And this is all on camera, and he's saying, "You're the top, you're the Colosseum." And he's sat on Brian Moore's lap. Oh. Brian's completely confused. And it made great television. We got 2 minutes of Brian Clough serenading Brian Moore.
Fantastic.
Wonderful.
Fantastic. And I'm sure you appreciated Cloughie's love of Sinatra as well, because you were involved in the Sinatra Appreciation Society, weren't you?
I was. Sinatra is number one for me as well. So Brian and I had that in common. In fact, when Cloughie and I used to talk, we used to spend most of the time talking about the Sinatra songs and Muhammad Ali, who was another one he idolised.
Did he ever talk about when he met Sinatra?
Yes. He said he was surrounded by bodyguards, but Frank had been told what I'd done in football, and he was very keen on sport. And he said the conversation switched from Frank singing to boxing, because I don't know if you know, Frank Sinatra was a boxing fanatic.
Oh, yeah.
He managed a fighter called Tammy Moriello, who was one of the bums of the month in the Joe Louis years. So Frank really was close to boxing. But Brian said, I wanted to talk recording, how he used to record his songs. He wanted to talk boxing. So he had a frustrating conversation with me.
Going back to Brian Moore, you saw Brian Clough again at Brian Moore's funeral.
Yes, I was privileged to give the eulogy for Brian Moore in a packed church in Kent. And there was a big overspill audience, and there were hundreds of people outside listening to it being broadcast. And Brian Clough had been very ill, and so we didn't expect to see him. And I'm halfway through my eulogy, and I've looked down, and there was very famous old George Robey's sort of eyebrows looking up at me, and Cloughie had made it, and I managed to ad-lib, how thrilled Brian Moore would be to think that his closest friend Cloughie has made it here for the funeral. And people actually in the middle of my eulogy, people applauded Cloughie for being there, because he was a very sick man at the time. After we'd finished, we met outside the church and we'd hugged each other. And Cloughie said, very nice tribute, young man. He said, but if I'd have been doing it, he said, I would have sung You're the Tops.
Yes, and I bet he would have done as well. Yeah,
yeah.
Talking of music, didn't Jimmy Greaves take the mickey out of your piano playing?
You've done your homework. Well, that's not a difficult thing to do if you could hear. But Jim, I always remember that he and I were in Wrexham doing an after dinner, and I was introduced to him. And that evening we stayed overnight at a private house where the daughter was a grade 8 classical pianist, and she's playing away. And Jimmy's interrupting. He said, "Can Norman have a go?" He said, "He does a great Bye Bye Blackbird." I mean, it doesn't sound particularly funny now, but I mean, it was funny and also humiliating.
Yes, like the pub pianist.
My dad was a pub pianist in the East End, and I've taken after him.
Yes. Oh. Coming back to Spurs, you've written lots of books about the club over the years. Now winning the FA Cup in '91, of course, meant the dream of Cloughie winning that elusive trophy never came true. Do you think if Cloughie had won the FA Cup then, that he'd have retired?
I think so. I think that was the one trophy that always eluded him. But remarkably, on that day, when, as you know, went to extra time, and Cloughie spent the whole of the extra time period not talking to his players, but talking to a young policeman, a young constable who was on duty at Wembley. Afterwards, we asked Brian, why didn't you gee out the players ready for the fun? He said, they're professional footballers. If they don't know how they're playing now, I'm not going to bloody tell them how to play football in 2 minutes. He said, and that young man, that young policeman, he said, what an interesting life he'd had. That was the Gaza game, as we remember.
It was, of course, yes.
Gaza came on, he was so het up, and he was stoked up.
Yeah.
He got into such a state, he went flying into crazy tackles.
Yeah.
And of course, was it Charles he tackled?
Yes. Yeah, it was Gary Parker and then Gary Charles, yeah.
Yeah, Gary Charles, but to tackle on Gary Charles, he did his knee.
Yeah.
And he had due to go to Lazio for £10 million, which was going to get Tottenham out of trouble because they were on the brink of bankruptcy at the time.
Mm.
And because of the injury, of course, he was on the sidelines for nearly a whole season. And then when he finally went to Lazio, he actually went there for £5 million. So it cut the fee in half.
We've spoken to the former FIFA referee Keith Hackett on the podcast previously, and I asked him if he thought Gaza should have been sent off at the time, and he said yes, without doubt. How do you feel about it looking back? Do you think there should have been a red card there?
Without question. I mean, if he hadn't been so badly injured, I think the red card would have come up.
Yeah.
But the referee almost felt, I can't send the poor lad off as well. Gaza tried to get up, he couldn't walk. And it put him out of the game for nearly a year. You think back to 91, I mean, both clubs were at their peak. And the way they both,
Yeah.
I mean, Spurs have won in the silverware since, not anything of note. And Forest, of course, went into a nosedive.
Yes.
Thank goodness it looks as though they're coming back. We hope so.
Now Forest are in the top flight. Do you think they stand a good chance of staying up?
I'm convinced that they will. I think there's a new feeling with not only within the club but within football that Forest are back where they belong, and I'll be amazed if they're not in the top half of the table at the end of the season.
And Spurs, Conte.
He's instilled new confidence, not only in the dressing room but among the spectators. There's a new mood of optimism, and we've got this fantastic stadium now, and we could have a team that's fit to play in it. And I think that Kane and Son together are going to. I think they'll dismantle most defences. Out of a springboard of deep defence, we break at speed, and it's very difficult to stop Kane and Son when they're really motoring.
Yeah. What do you think Cloughie would have made of Forest's return to the top flight?
About bloody time.
Yes.
Brian had East Midlands in his blood, he's a man from Yorkshire.
Yeah.
But he's very much an East Midlands man.
Well, he wouldn't be too impressed with Derby going down either, would he, really? And the way that's gone.
Not only going down, the way they were run.
How will you remember Brian Clough?
These are the words that come to mind when I think of Brian Clough.
Yeah.
Dynamic, driving, single-minded, perceptive, inspiring, controversial, stubborn, ruthless, courageous, energetic, tough, ambitious, egotistical, and, let me add, he was also a warm, kind and generous man. And I will remember Brian with great fondness, and not only as a great man of the beautiful game, but as a great human being who did so much very quietly for charity and for people down on their luck. Brian was always the first to offer a helping hand, quietly. People thought he was bombastic, which he could be, but he did a lot of things quietly that didn't make the headlines. And that was the real Brian Clough, and the Brian Clough that I want to remember.
That's a wonderful tribute.
Can I just add, Marcus, he could not play the game. He was not a skillful footballer, but he'd run through brick walls, and never was there a lost cause. If that ball was still live, he was chasing it, and defenders hated playing against him.
He was absolutely incredible, wasn't he, as a striker for both Middlesbrough and then Sunderland?
Brian was one of the few who matched Jimmy Greaves on the scoring ratio, and he didn't have Jimmy's skill, and Brian would have been the first to admit that. But what he had was a determination that came from the gods. I mean, while the ball was live, Cloughie thought he could put it into the net, and his goal-scoring record with both Middlesbrough and then Sunderland was extraordinary. And if it hadn't been for his injury, he would have been up there with Greaves with at least 350 goals, I would have thought.
And then on the other side of the coin, he perhaps wouldn't have gone into management so quickly and learnt his trade at Hartlepool, I guess.
No, Well, when he and Peter Taylor at Hartlepool, I mean, he was almost a boy wonder of a manager, wasn't he? And he had revolutionary ideas then that he brought to Derby, then took them to Forest. And what a record the man had. I mean, for Nottingham Forest to have won back-to-back European Cups was unbelievable. And it's one of the greatest achievements ever in English football.
Hear, hear. Well, there are more details about your book on Jimmy Greaves in the show notes for this episode and how people are able to buy a copy. Norman Giller, thanks so much for joining us today and sharing your memories. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, and keep wearing that green jumper with pride. All the best. Have a good season and enjoy football in the World Cup in that football hotbed of Qatar.
Oh, yes.
I would love to have heard Cloughie on that subject.
Yes.
Qatar? Bloody Qatar?
Can you imagine? I don't think he'd be impressed somehow. Thanks again, and take care. Bye.
Thank you.
And if you're interested in finding out more about Norman's books, including signed copies of the book The One and Only Jimmy Greaves, it's an easy website to remember. Just visit normangillerbooks.com. And the details are also mentioned in the show notes for this episode. And of course, for Brian Clough tribute books and other items helping the types of good causes that Cloughie supported, there's always the tribute website brianclough.com, and I can sign books personally for you. Thanks again for listening, and I hope you'll join me soon for more memories of the great man in the green jumper.